So the video I'm about to play, it looks simple. It's just Nate Diaz just lighting up a joint, smoking at open workouts. You think not much of it. It's a funny clip. Nate Diaz, he's known as the weed guy. Here he is smoking some weed or whatever, CBD as he said it is. I think whether it's CBD or not, if you're watching this, you might as well just assume it's weed and go along with that. This seems simple. Seems like there's not much to it. It's just Nate Diaz being Nate Diaz. To me, this is much bigger than just Nate Diaz being Nate Diaz. This is Nate Diaz doing the UFC and ESPN a major favor because of how poorly the UFC and ESPN have been promoting their events recently. If you're so here's the thing. You look back at some of the things that people would talk about with the UFC in the past. They would talk about how guys like Mighty Mouse, Benson Henderson, some of the other champions were just not promoted particularly well. And people would say, hey, why didn't the UFC promote these guys better? Why didn't they make them bigger stars? And to me, I defended them. And my defense for them was, look, if you're promoting a fighter, what that generally means is you're giving up some kind of asset, whether you're spending money, both on the production and also the ad buys for it, or if you're just like taking an opportunity cost and say that you've got an event going on and you're going to run a promo for a future fight and you're promoting a fighter, there's an expense to that. And as with any other advertising expense, you expect there to be a return on that advertisement. So if you have guys like Ben Henderson or like Demetrius Johnson, where you're spending on them, you're trying to get them out there, and fans just aren't reacting, and you're not really getting a big return on it, then it would make sense to say, hey, look, we tried, we're not getting much of a return. Let's use those opportunities on fighters who we actually are getting returns on. It seems like with ESPN, they're going in the opposite direction. Rather than trying to make the biggest returns on their promotions, they're sort of like going in the direction that I think people wanted in the past, where they're just starting to promote the guys who are on the top of the card more so than the guys who are going to actually sell the card. And this UFC 241 fight, I think, is just a major case of it. So if you look at the card itself, one thing we have to remember, and I think it's worth mentioning first, if you watch that Shevchenko fight against Carmouche, they did a handful of promos for this UFC 241 event. And one of the things you noticed with that is that they would constantly promote fight by fight rather than talking about the card as a whole. So you would get these promos that were just talking about the main event with Stipe versus Daniel Cormier. And rather than being Stipe versus Daniel Cormier, and then at the end it's like, oh, and also Nate Diaz and also Yoel Romero versus Paulo Borrachinha. It would just be Daniel Cormier versus Stipe and that's it, or Stipe and that's it. It's worth remembering this fight, DC versus Stipe, is happening as a plan B. Plan A was DC versus Brock Lesnar. This rematch wasn't really supposed to happen right now. What was supposed to happen was that DC beats Stipe. Now, granted, he stepped up to save a card in New York where they didn't really have a good main event, so he fought Derek Lewis. But the idea was that he would beat Stipe, he'd fight Brock Lesnar, and then if he'd either retire at that point, or then maybe if during that process Stipe gets a win, then they have the rematch. Instead, he waits for Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar doesn't come. Stipe doesn't fight, and DC has a back injury, so he's not able to fight for a while up until now. This really isn't the fight that they wanted at heavyweight, but it's the fight they're taking. But it's also pretty obvious that it's not the most marketable fight on the card. The most marketable fight on the card is the co-main event between Nate Diaz and Anthony Pettis. And so if you are going to say, hey, look, Daniel Cormier has the heavyweight title, he's got the belt, we got to promote him more. Okay, I get that. Granted, it's worth noting that Daniel Cormier is saying out loud he doesn't plan on being here that long, so how much promotion do you want to invest in an asset that's not going to be around for a whole lot longer? I think you should probably temper that. But you still want to make sure anytime you're talking about DC versus Stipe, at the end of that promo, you're still saying, oh, and by the way, Nate Diaz is coming back for the first time in 3 years when he fought Conor McGregor in a decision that he lost that was rather close. They really aren't doing that. And one of the things that I think is pretty interesting is that if you look at the UFC, they have this, it's not embedded. They have the bigger, I'm trying to think what those are called. It's like the 40-minute clip, though, where they, gosh, I'm getting caught up on the name. Never mind the name. But it's the 40-minute clip where they have the preview for the main event with Stipe versus Daniel, and they have the preview with Pettis versus Nate Diaz. So they have one clip where it's all 40 minutes. They have one clip where it's just the main event, and they have one clip where it's just the co-main event. The clip where it's just the co-main event, or the fight with Pettis and Diaz, is significantly getting more traffic than the clip with Cormier versus Miocic. So you have to understand, for the UFC, you need to play into the fact that Nate Diaz is fighting here, and they haven't done a very good job of that. Even with some of the biggest shows on ESPN, like they brought DC on to First Take. They didn't bring Nate Diaz on a First Take. That makes no sense to me. That's the guy you want out there. You want people to understand that Nate Diaz is fighting right now. And by him doing this little thing where he's smoking the joint at open workouts, what that creates is it creates a viral clip. And as that clip spreads around, people are going to realize, oh, wait, Nate Diaz is fighting this week. And as a result of them realizing that, they're probably going to be a lot more likely to buy than they otherwise would have. Even if they were interested in the main event, at least now you have another thing to add on top of it. So you're adding more value for this UFC 241 package rather than it just being the main event. So Nate Diaz doing a very big favor to ESPN when they weren't doing themselves any favors by not promoting this fight between Diaz and Pettis properly. Yes, they've done some promotion on it, but for as big of a fight as it is, it deserves a lot more attention than it's gotten. But if we look back at some of the other cards, and I'm primarily going to focus on the Colby Covington versus Robbie Lawler card because this was such an epic failure in so many ways, and they suffered in the ratings as a result. Let me see where I can find it. I'll have to go back through here. But if you think about how a fight between Robbie Lawler and Colby Covington should be promoted, it's a very easy answer. It's simple. You have Colby Covington, from a pro wrestling standpoint, who's a very obvious heel. He intends to be the heel. He plays the heel. And you have Robbie Lawler, who's a well-liked guy who would fit in that babyface category. But he's not just a babyface, but he's a very violent one at that. Though he doesn't have a ton of like one-punch knockouts, he's got plenty of violent things you can pull on from his highlight reel. So whether it's him slamming Ben Askren to the mat or slamming Ben Askren and then hitting him after, whether it's that head kick of Bobby Volker, there are a lot of highlights you can play on where you can really play into this idea of here's this guy that you may or may not like, but you probably don't like. Here's a guy who can do a lot of damage to him. Now let's watch. Now you definitely want to watch the fight and see if he's able to do it. And they didn't really play into that at all. Rather than playing into the idea that you have a guy in Colby Covington who's this really big heel, and Robbie Lawler might be the guy to beat him up, they try to make Colby Covington into a babyface. And the promos, rather than them being promos where you have Colby doing his little shtick with the girls, whether you have Colby in the White House shaking Donald Trump's hands, whether you have the announcement of Colby getting the first family to actually come to the fight, rather than playing to these things that are a little bit more divisive and things where some people are gonna be like, all right, this is awesome, I'm cheering on Colby, I didn't know that about him, and now I really like him. Or gonna have people going the other way where it's like, what, Colby's a Trump guy? Screw Colby, I want to see him lose. Oh, cool, this guy he's fighting knocks people out. Awesome, now I actually want to see that. That's a really simple story to tell, and they didn't tell it. Rather, with Colby, they decided that the story for Colby would be he's this really nice guy who's really nice to the Navy. What? Why? Like, why are we trying to make Colby a babyface in a very obvious fight where he's fighting a guy in Robbie Lawler who can fill that role? There's just no need for that. There's no reason for them to do that. But they did that anyway. And for one, they had the poor promotion on it. For two, this wasn't exactly the UFC's fault that it had to be so early because they had the Hall of Fame ceremony for the NFL. So for ESPN, they had to push it up. But this was the worst rated UFC on ESPN event. And the fact that they underpromoted the main event so badly, it just doesn't make sense to me. They told the completely wrong story on it. And on top of that, they really didn't tell you much about some of the guys who were fighting on the undercard. And for one, if you look at a lot of people who watch these UFC events, especially the casual fans, a lot of them, they'll recognize some names like, well, Jim Miller and Clay Guida. So you think it'd be pretty important to say, oh, hey, by the way, Jim Miller versus Clay Guida is happening. And you'll have some people who maybe haven't watched the UFC in a couple of years, but they remember a crazy Clay Guida fight. That might be the type of thing that pushes them over the edge and says, okay, you know what, fine, I'm going to watch this card. You really didn't know that Jim Miller and Clay Guida were fighting if you just watched the promos. But you also had some other interesting fights. This Nasrat Haqparast versus Joaquim Silva fight was interesting. You could have sold that a little bit. I mean, the card itself wasn't terribly deep, but just the poor sales job on that main event was just shocking to me. And even if you look at the last card, the fight that just happened over the weekend with Valentina Shevchenko and Liz Carmouche, you had a good storyline there as well, where you had this dominant flyweight champion, Valentina Shevchenko, whose only losses are to the woman's goat, Amanda Nunes, and they were both close fights. She won rounds in each of them, and you could argue that she won the last one. I personally wouldn't make that argument. I thought Nunes did beat her 3-2. But with that being said, there's a great storyline to tell Valentina, both of her as a person, because she's an extremely interesting person, a person who can speak, I think, at least 4 languages, has lived all over the world, sort of like fits this archetype of like a Bond villain. And then you have Liz Carmouche, who is actually beaten her. So you can say, hey, this is the super dominant champion here. You can tell us more about tell us more about Valentina Shevchenko, all while building up this idea of, hey, this could be the girl who beats her because she's done it already. And you really didn't get that story. It was just like, all right, well, Shevchenko's back, and she's fighting Carmouche. And there just wasn't like a really great storyline that was told. And it just made it hard to really get a reason to watch it. But even on top of that, there were some other good fights on this card that you really hardly heard anything about. This Luque versus Perry fight could have been told a lot better. There's a lot of clips you can make from their previous fights to show how violent that fight could be and how violent it ended up being. Ozdemir and Latifi could have done a little bit of work with. But the big one for me that was just shocking to me is how little Rodolfo Vieira was promoted. You have this guy whose jiu-jitsu credentials, you could argue that if there was like an open weight jiu-jitsu tournament right now in the UFC that includes Damian Maia, that includes Jacare Souza, that Rodolfo Vieira wins that tournament. I think I would actually put money on Rodolfo Vieira winning that tournament. and you heard hardly anything about it. So to me, just a lot of wasted opportunities by ESPN.